On this special occasion, we have some guests in our midst. This is a joint initiative of PTHU, Professor Dineke Houtman, there she is, and the Baptists. And to articulate more, it's also an opportunity, an occasion of de stichting voor de bevordering van wetenschappelijk onderwijs in de judaïstiek. Dat is er. De volle mond. A special welcome to Chaim Eisen. We keep good memories of your lectures here 2 years ago. They were adequate, full of insight, and so on. So we feel privileged to have you this afternoon here speak to us again on the subject, the presence of God in prayer. And I know you're a man of prayer. Yes, I know. Amen. So let's give Chaim a hand and welcome here on the stage.
Shalom, everyone. This topic is massive. So we'll plunge right in and see how much we can consider. With respect to prayer and our seeking God's presence through it, I will note at the outset 2 questions that are so endemic in any discussion of prayer that we can't even leave the starting gate without articulating these questions. Number 1, is prayer petitionary? That is prayer in order for us to make requests? Well, there's a very simple, straightforward answer. Sometimes. Next question, is prayer theurgic? That is, are we, through prayer, soliciting divine intervention? Well, we could give a very straightforward answer to that question as well. Maybe. So, with these 2 admittedly thoroughly dissatisfying answers, 1 word apiece, sometimes, maybe, we'll embark upon our journey. And I hope over the course of the next couple of hours, we'll be able to put some flesh onto these skeletal 1-word answers. I hope. Okay. Okay, so let's first begin. Inevitably, we would be able to charge forward so much more readily if we could just have all of the proceedings in Hebrew. So I realize that might pose some technical difficulties, but at the very least, we need to put some Hebrew right in front of us, right at the outset. For the Hebrew experts, Pei Lamed Lamed is a 3-letter root. Now, truth be told, in biblical Hebrew, there are multiple terms that refer to the way we address God. But by far the most common, by far the most frequent, is this root, Pei Lamed Lamed. In particular, in the overwhelming majority of instances, in a curiously reflexive declination, lehitpalel. Again, with an appeal to the Hebrew experts. The reflexive hitpa'el form implies that whatever one is doing to oneself. Exactly how that coheres with lehitpalel, referring to our praying to God, is another good question. I'm not even going to attempt a 1-word answer here. I'll just say, we'll see. A 2-word answer. Okay, so that stated then, I'd like to commence with a survey of this root in its reflexive form, lehitpalel, in the Bible. This is not going to be an exhaustive survey. We don't have time for that. But I would like to at least consider all of the instances in which the root appears in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses, and at least a smattering of additional instances that we can consider through the words of the prophets. So where does this root appear for the very first time in the Torah? Answer, in Genesis chapter 20. In particular, in verse 7, that's the beginning of a passage that also culminates in its reappearance in practice in verse 17. The context, Avimelech, the king of Gerar, has taken Sarah and he experiences a divinely inspired dream. Evidently, as emerges in the context, it is clearly not prophecy, but it is sufficiently explicit to inform him that he is, as we read in verse 7, now to return the wife of the man, referring to Abraham, for he is a Navi, a prophet. Obviously, by implication, despite the fact that you are experiencing this dream, you are not. And he will pray, ve'yitpalel, on your behalf, and you will live. And if you don't restore, know that you shall surely die, you and all that is yours. And again in verse 17, Abraham prays to God, and Avimelech and his household are healed. Obviously, this is an instance of petitionary prayer. This is, moreover, prayer to redress, to avert a decree that has otherwise been decreed by God. In this case, of course, upon Avimelech and his household. We might note the curious emphasis upon Abraham being a prophet here. How is that specifically germane with respect to the context? Is it specifically germane with respect to prayer? Of course, one possibility, perhaps a more prosaic possibility, is since he is a prophet, he will know that you have not violated Sarah, and therefore he will be amenable to praying on your behalf. But perhaps on a somewhat more sublime plane, we should consider the implication of being a Navi, which again we render as prophet. There is indeed discussion among the commentators, among students of biblical Hebrew, as to just what the etymology of Navi, meaning prophet, is. But to share with you what is probably the predominant view, and that is explicitly enunciated by the great biblical commentator Rashi, Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, one of the great sages of primarily the 11th century. He notes this in his commentary on the appearance of the word Navi in Exodus chapter 7, verse 1, which we won't discuss at the moment, that Navi should be associated etymologically with the word Niv, as, for example, we find it in Isaiah chapter 57, verse 19. Creating Niv Sfatayim, expression of the lips. Similarly, in Proverbs chapter 10, verse 31, Yanuv Chokhmah, to express wisdom. The Navi is one who expresses. And to the extent then that the Navi is endowed with the wherewithal to express, of course, generically, this describes the prophet whose role is to express God's message to the world. Contextually here, he knows how to address God. He knows how to express himself in prayer. Because what is admittedly not explicitly stated here, but presumptive, is that prayer will entail some expression. You say something. This again is the first instance. We'll consider the next two instances, which are contextually similar, both in the book of Numbers. In Numbers chapter 11, in verse 2. Clearly also in the wake of a decree by God. In this instance, the fire burning and consuming in the edge of the encampment by consequence of the people's murmuring in, as it were, the hearing of God. We read in, again, chapter 11, verse 2, that the people screamed out to Moses, and Moses prayed to God, and the fire abated. Again, in a similar context, the next instance, in chapter 21, in verse 7, here it isn't a fire in the sense of flames, but the fiery serpents, the venomous serpents, whom God sends by consequence of the people speaking against God and against Moses and complaining about the manna. The people come to Moses and say, "We have sinned because we have spoken against God and against you." And they solicit Moses here explicitly, which was not the case in chapter 11, to pray to God to withdraw the snakes from among us. And again, Moses prayed on behalf of the people. Once again, manifestly, petitionary prayer. A decree that is to be averted or withdrawn, the snakes to be removed from the encampment. And the last context in which we encounter again the declination in the hitpa'el form, hitpalel, in the 5 books of Moses, this in the retrospective aftermath of the sin of the golden calf. And it's interesting that hitpalel does not appear in the original narrative, but in Deuteronomy chapter 9, we read in verse 20 that against Aaron, God was exceedingly wroth to destroy him, and I prayed also on behalf of Aaron at this time. And indeed, similarly, when we read of the 40 days of supplication that are described in verse 25, they conclude in verse 26 with, I prayed to God and said. And the description of the prayer, which once again will affirm, is something explicitly enunciated, explicitly expressed. So, in all these instances, indeed, unequivocally, prayer is petitionary. The goal of prayer is theurgic, that God should intervene, as it were, supernaturally in the withdrawal of the decree that has already been decreed. We continue in the words of the prophets. Where's the next place that prayer appears? It's interesting that the verb does not appear even once in the book of Joshua or the book of Judges, but it appears very, very famously at the beginning of the book of Samuel, the prayer of Hannah. And we'll be returning to her prayer shortly because of the colossal implications that it has in our considering, from the perspective of Jewish tradition, what prayer signifies. But of course, what is salient here is the implicit decree of barrenness that she is attempting to rescind through her prayer, the vow that she makes with God. This in the first book of Samuel, in chapter 1, in particular, verses 10 to 13. I'm not going to read it right now because, again, we will have occasion to return to these verses, but I am noting it because it's a critical example of what prayer signifies. Now, again, I'm not going to continue with an exhaustive survey at this point, but there are certain highlights that I feel especially compelled to share with you. And perhaps one of the most dramatic instances of prayer that demands mention here is in the second book of Kings, in chapter 20. I'll note that the prayer and its context are reiterated 2 more times in the Hebrew Bible, in Isaiah chapter 38, and in the second book of Chronicles, in chapter 32. The prayer being the prayer of King Hezekiah. After God sends Isaiah to him with a very stern broadcast. Isaiah comes to King Hezekiah and says to him this in the first verse of the chapter: charge your household, because you are going to die and you won't live. Now, there certainly appears to be a discontinuity between this utterly grim prognosis and the reaction of King Hezekiah in turning to the wall nonetheless and praying. And I feel compelled to share with you, admittedly this is slightly digressive with respect to a biblical survey, but nonetheless, the elaboration on this passage that is provided in the Talmud, in the first chapter of the Babylonian Talmud of Masechet Brachot, which essentially overlays the discourse here with additional exchange, additional discourse between Isaiah and King Hezekiah. First, in considering, again, the grim prognosis, you are dying and you won't live. Sounds redundant. Well, in fact, proposes the Talmud, the prognosis was an awful lot more grim than in fact it sounded. Not only are you dying in this world, but you won't live in the world to come either. King Hezekiah, such a righteous king, why such devastating verdict? And when King Hezekiah asks for clarification, the prophet's response is, because you didn't have children. To which, again, in the reconstruction in the Talmud, King Hezekiah responds, I didn't have children for a good reason, because the stargazers told me that if I have children, my child is going to be exceedingly wicked. Now, of course, in our retrospective sophistication, we know very well who was the son of King Hezekiah. Menashe, the worst king in all of the history of the First Commonwealth. The king who transformed the Holy Temple itself into an idolatrous shrine. So, irrespective of the merits or lack thereof of prognostication, he got it right. And the response that is attributed here to Isaiah, which undoubtedly on manifold planes is of vast and crucial implications in manifold arenas of life, is these hidden matters of God are none of your business. What you are commanded, you must do. And what God wants to happen is his domain. He'll make it happen or not. In other words, don't waste your time in prognosticating. You have, in our parlance, I'll say, you have a mitzvah. You have a divine charge to have a family, to have children, and you are not absolved of the obligation to fulfill this mitzvah. We don't even have to add the additional dimension, which is, of course, inevitably that the lineage of King Hezekiah running through Menashe will lead to the Messiah. But besides that, you have a commandment to fulfill. Whereupon, again in the reconstruction of the Talmud, King Hezekiah accepts the rebuke and says, okay, I'll make a deal with you. Give me your daughter as my bride. I'll marry her, and maybe by your merit and my merit, we'll have a child who will be worthy. So of course at this stage, after the prophecy that Isaiah was sent to enunciate to King Hezekiah, we can well imagine what his response is. No way! I'm not marrying off my daughter to someone who's going to die tomorrow. I don't want her to become a widow after one day of marriage. And to this, Hezekiah's response is, in the parlance of the Talmud, son of Amoz, finish off your prophecy and leave. so I have received as a tradition from my forefathers' household, even if a sharpened sword is placed against your throat, you are not to despair of divine compassion. And, of course, in terms of the narrative here, the continuation obviously bears out that conclusion. Because King Hezekiah does pray to God. Isaiah has already left. And yet, of course, what we read immediately afterward is in verse 4, Isaiah had not yet left the middle courtyard, and the word of God came to him saying, go back to Hezekiah, the prince of my people, and tell him, so says God, the Lord of David, your father, I have heard your prayer, I have seen your tear, I am healing you. On the third day, you will ascend to the house of God, and you've gotten another 15 years. This after Isaiah said, it's all over. Petitionary prayer, theurgic prayer, in its most dramatic. There is an explicitly enunciated prophecy. And King Hezekiah says, I don't care, I'm praying. Now, there is, of course, a tantalizing question that you should undoubtedly be wondering with respect to this Talmudic superimposition on the text, and that is, what tradition? How did he know this? What information did he have from his forefather's household? And the implicit reference is the final chapter in the book of Samuel, the second book of Samuel, and likewise in the first book of Chronicles, in chapter 21, when you will undoubtedly recall, we read of the devastating plague that strikes the nation in the aftermath of the census that David conducts. Whereupon God sends Gad the seer to David to choose a punishment. He says, let me fall in the hands of God because his compassion is great and not in the hands of man. And God sends a plague of pestilence in Israel. And the consequences of the plague are indeed devastating. We read in the version in the first book of Chronicles, chapter 21, verse 14, one day 70,000 of Israel perished. And in verse 15, God sent the angel to Jerusalem to destroy it. What is described cryptically and tersely in verse 15 is elaborated upon in the verses that follow. On the brink of the destruction, God saw and reconsidered the evil and said to the angel that was destroying, enough. Now slacken your hand. And the angel was standing with the threshing floor of Ornan, the Jebusite. What happened? Again, the verses that follow are clearly not subsequent chronologically, but rather elaborating upon that terse statement that David lifts up his eyes and he sees the angel of God standing between the earth and the heavens. Parenthetical note, where can one see the angel of God standing between the earth and heaven? What spot is there that is between the earth and the heavens? The threshing floor of Ornan the Jebusite is the site of the Holy Temple. That is the spot on earth that is between earth and the heavens. Close parentheses. That's not relevant for our purpose right now. And his sword was drawn in his hand, extended over Jerusalem, poised to strike. And David doesn't despair. David and the elders who are with him throw themselves upon their faces with sackcloth upon themselves, and David says to God, I was the one who said to count the people. I was the one who sinned and acted evilly, and the sheep, what have they done? God, my Lord, let your hand be against me and against my father's house, and not against your people in plague. And that, precisely, is what serves as the reason for the withdrawal of the plague. As we read in verse 27, God said to the angel to put the sword back in its scabbard as a symbol that the plague ends. So, returning to King Hezekiah, obviously this is not in the biblical narrative. It is a superimposition, but we can well appreciate the connection. Just as David, although he doesn't use the verb hitpalel, nonetheless, confronted with this dire decree that God had already decreed, does not despair, but rather throws himself down and prays to God, and the plague is withdrawn. So too King Hezekiah receives this horrific decree of death, and his response is not despair, but rather prayer. So of course, all of these examples manifestly serve to bolster the same thesis that we saw at the outset. Prayer being petitionary, and prayer indeed having theurgic effect. The decree is withdrawn. And that is undoubtedly one of the contexts in which hitpalel unequivocally appears. I would even be inclined to say it is predominant. But simultaneously, it certainly is not by any means the only one. So now let's consider some other examples. Let's in particular go back to the book of Samuel. In fact, go back to Hannah. Because while Hannah teaches us very explicitly about petitionary prayer in the first chapter of Samuel, that's not her only prayer. In the second chapter of the book of Samuel, she prays again. The opening words of chapter 2. Hannah prayed and said, same word, vatitpalel. If you read the passage from verse 1 through verse 10, does she ask for anything? Is there a petition here at all? What makes this prayer? And yet the same exact word is used, vatitpalel. We can consider another case in point, perhaps not essentially dissimilar, with her son. That is, in chapter 8, when we read in verses 4 and 5 of the request by all of the elders of Israel of the prophet Samuel to appoint over them a king to judge them like all the nations. Ouch! That wasn't the right thing to say. But the reaction of Samuel, the matter was evil in the eyes of Samuel when they said, appoint over us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to God. What did he say? We don't know. It doesn't say. But given that there certainly isn't any well-defined decree that could be the object of the prayer, and moreover, given that God's response neither affirms nor denies any petition. Doesn't seem that there was any petition here at all. God provides Samuel with, admittedly, the dubious consolation that it wasn't that they have disdained him, Samuel, actually they disdained God. But in any case, it certainly wasn't a matter of a petition that was either going to be granted or not. As a similar sort of case in point, consider in Jeremiah, in chapter 32. In Jeremiah chapter 32, beginning in verse 6, we read of the prophecy. God tells Jeremiah that Hanamel, the son of Shalom, his uncle, is going to come to him to offer to him, to Jeremiah, to buy his field which is in Anatot. And he is charged with doing so. And there's a very vivid description of the manner in which the sale is completed and solemnized. Parenthetically, we learn many of the rules of a valid sale according to the law of God from this passage. Again, closed parentheses, it's not relevant for our purposes right now. But after completing the sale, the prophet Jeremiah, in verse 15, reports the message of it all, which is, "So says the God of hosts, the Lord of Israel, there will yet be bought houses and fields and vineyards in this land." So Jeremiah completes his mission, and what then follows, so poignantly, is, "I prayed to God after giving the bill of sale to Baruch ben Neriah." And what ensues is a vivid description of the calamitous circumstances in which this is taking place. Circumstances in which, as we read in verses 24 and up to 25, the conclusion of the prayer, the ramparts, the siege walls have already come to the city to seize it, and the city is given into the hands of the Chaldeans who are fighting against it through the sword and famine and pestilence, as you spoke. And behold, it is. And now you say to me, God, my Lord, to buy this field with money and to set up witnesses. And the city is given in the hands of the Chaldeans. And this is the prayer. But what is he requesting? There is no request. And in some sense, that there is no request becomes manifestly clear in the opening words of God's response, which ensues immediately afterward. In verse 27, "Behold, I am God, the Lord of all flesh. Shall anything be too wondrous for me?" What is he saying? Of course, ultimately, yes, there are words of consolation, but there doesn't seem to have been any well-defined petition for such consolation, nor was it a response to such a petition. Jeremiah's prayer is an expression, no doubt, of the personal travail that he is experiencing. But it's not a petition. There's nothing theurgic here, nor is there in God's response. And perhaps the most dramatic illustration of this principle, and this will be our last for now because there's much too much else that we need to consider, we consider in the prophecy of Jonah. In the book of Jonah, there is an interesting and somewhat perplexing interlude between chapter 1 and chapter 3, which of course is chapter 2. Now, in chapter 2, verse 2, of course we read, "Vayitpalel Yonah." Yonah, the prophet Jonah, prayed. The context in which Jonah is praying becomes very dramatically articulated in verse 1. He is in the belly of a fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Now, I realize this might be quite a leap of our imagination, but let's engage in a kind of thought experiment right now. If you were in the belly of a fish for 3 days and 3 nights, and you were going to pray to God, what would you say? Get me out of here! And what is so dramatically absent from his prayer any word of petition. He doesn't request anything. What's the prayer for? What does it mean? What does it do? Good questions. But good questions, of course, don't need immediate answers. But we should obviously consider these passages together with those that we have already considered in recognizing that inevitably the answer to our opening question, is prayer petitionary, can only be sometimes. Because sometimes clearly it is not. Now, this is, if you will, my opening volley in considering what we can glean about lehit palel directly from the words of the Bible. Perhaps before we continue, I should solicit from you any questions? Because we don't have any, I'm going to continue. Okay.
No, maybe
Yes.
because you said there was a petitionary prayer, and then you said there's other meanings, other prayers.
Right.
So can you also, because there are also types of prayer like praising God and that sort of thing. So maybe you can make some divisions there too. I mean,
Maybe.
It's not just petitionary.
But again,
other,
as I already pointed out, though,
praise and other things.
but good questions don't require immediate answers. I think you should sweat on this one for now.
Okay.
We'll get back to it. I'm not intending to leave, just leaving this matter dangling, but
Thanks.
I don't know for what. But no, the question is definitely well taken. I will again note that we could discuss many other terms in biblical Hebrew that pertain to our addressing God.
Also-
The Hallel,
Yeah.
for example, as a case in point, means to praise. And that is exclusively words of praise. But I'm specifically focusing upon Lehit Palel because certainly as the normative word for prayer, both in biblical Hebrew and in post-biblical Hebrew, that unquestionably seizes the lion's share of our attention. The problem, of course, is that this word itself is ambiguous in its meanings. Clearly, it's being used in more than one sentence, which is a problem. And problems, of course, are the spice of life. So, at least of scholarship. Okay, so, yes.
Yeah, you started your first quote from the Torah with a connection with Navi.
That's the first place that
Yeah.
prayer appears, yes.
Yeah. So, and then you gave all these examples from all the Hebrew scriptures. Do you conclude that Lehit Palel is always connected with prophetic?
No, I definitely wouldn't make that assumption. But what I will state, and here I do think the juxtaposition in the first instance in which Lehit Palel appears is that it does involve expression. And to that extent, the idea that the Navi, admittedly, this is a point of debate, but if we take the track that Navi literally means the one who expresses, then the connection between Navi and the Yit Palel may indeed be underlining that aspect of prayer, that it does involve expression. And that actually is the next issue that I'd like to address. Because it is, of course, on manifold planes, of great interest for us to consider this survey of Lehit Palel in the Bible, but from a Jewish perspective, it is inadequate because that, on some plane, skirts what is the most important foundational issue from a Jewish perspective in any such discussion, which is practical application. That is, it's all well and good to talk about concepts in the abstract, but taking those concepts and anchoring them in concrete action in this world is our foremost imperative, which inevitably pertains to the question of how do we relate to the very nature of prayer? Most fundamentally, most essentially, is it a mitzvah? Is it a commandment to pray? None of these instances in which the root palel, lehit palel, appears has anything to do with an imperative. And it is striking, and I think for our purposes undoubtedly germane, for us to consider what, from the perspective of the Midrash and the Talmud, becomes the scriptural basis of a mitzvah pertaining to prayer. The verse upon which the Midrash in the Sifrei principally focuses, and indeed the relevant Talmudic passages do as well, is not one that employs the word hitpalel at all. It is rather in Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 13. Now, before we consider what Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 13 states, I feel compelled to note that while, of course, we revere every word in Tanakh, and in particular in the Torah and the 5 books of Moses as divine dictation, that doesn't necessarily mean that all biblical real estate is equivalent. What I mean by that is, Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 13 is the opening verse of the second paragraph of the Shema that Jews recite at least twice daily. That is, you won't be able to find a practicing Jew with tweezers and a magnifying glass who does not know this by heart. Everyone does. And that in itself obviously casts the context of this derivation in a particularly intensive tenor in considering what the verse states. It refers to loving God your Lord and serving Him with all of your heart and with all of your souls. And the rhetorical question that is expressed in the Midrash, in the Talmud, is what service is there in one's heart? Le'ovdo b'chol levavchem, serving God in one's heart. That is prayer. And by implication, and of course, a question that will still be germane is this verse enunciating a mandate? Is it an imperative? Is it then a mitzvah or not? We'll get back to that question very shortly. But to consider the implications of appropriating this verse for prayer will already lead us to some practical and concrete conclusions. If I may share with you an insight of one of the great scholars of our tradition of the last generation, Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, passed away in 1992, the great rabbinical leaders of the last generation, in keeping with the dialectical approach that very much characterizes the scholarly tradition from which he hailed, he considered two similar but distinct concepts, namely the act of doing a precept, doing a mitzvah, and the fulfillment of the precept, the fulfillment of the mitzvah. What's the difference between them? Well, in point of fact, in the vast majority of mitzvot, there is none. That is, in most instances, if you are doing the act of the mitzvah, that in itself is the fulfillment of the mitzvah. But that pertains to those mitzvot that are performed physically, if you will, by our limbs. However, if we consider a mitzvah such as prayer, I realize I'm putting the cart before the horse a little bit because we haven't established that it is a mitzvah. But if we propose that it is a mitzvah for now, the fulfillment of this mitzvah, as explicitly articulated here, is where? In your heart. I'm sure you will realize we mean the metaphorical heart rather than the physical organ here. But the act of doing the mitzvah is verbal expression. You need to say something. again, apropos of that first instance in which prayer appears. Prayer is always speaking. The nature of that speaking we'll need to refine further, and indeed, the Talmud, in discussing this, does so by soliciting chana as an arc template of prayer. But while there is enunciation as the act of praying, the fulfillment of prayer is serving God in one's heart. And indeed, this occasions a more elaborate discussion, in particular in the Talmud, in the Jerusalem Talmud, Tractate Brachot, chapter 4, in the first halacha. After first citing this verse, in considering whether indeed the service to which reference is made here is to prayer, the first verse that the Talmud cites, a verse that we haven't cited yet, because the verb hitpalel doesn't appear, although undoubtedly it would if the verse were in Hebrew. That, I suppose, is already a good hint as to which book, or one of the books, from which this verse must be taken. After all, much of the book of Daniel and the book of Ezra are not written in Hebrew, but rather in Aramaic. And in Daniel, in chapter 6, we read of the manner in which Daniel responds to the decree by Darius to not pray to anything other than the state-sanctioned religion. How does Daniel react to that? He doesn't at all. He just keeps on praying. And what we read in particular in this regard, let's begin with verse 11, that when Daniel heard that the royal edict had been recorded, he came to his home, and he had open windows in the attic or the upper floor facing Jerusalem, and 3 times a day he would kneel upon his knees and pray and give thanks before his God, just as he had done beforehand. So Daniel is praying. The crucial nuance that is enunciated in the Talmudic passage is that Daniel is described in verse 17 as serving God, and that service, very much apropos of Deuteronomy chapter 11, verse 13, is manifestly not some act. Obviously, it couldn't be the sacrificial service, which doesn't exist outside of the precincts of the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. It was prayer. So again, appropriating this verse because of the practical implications, we see prayer is directed to Jerusalem, an idea that is implicit in the first book of Kings, in chapter 8 as well, in the prayer of King Solomon. Prayer, in Daniel's case, is described as being done 3 times daily. And moreover, with respect to how one goes about praying, the passage that the Talmud appropriates most of all, and I already referred to it as having that role earlier on, is the passage in the opening chapter of the book of Samuel that describes what Hannah is doing in praying to God. So for our purposes, I'll merely note the points of salient emphasis with respect to Hannah, that is, inasmuch as we read in the first book of Samuel, chapter 1, verse 13, Hannah was, I'm translating literally here, speaking upon her heart. Parenthetically, we regard the expression upon one's heart as implying control of one's heart, and it is a term exclusively associated with the righteous and reflects a similar expression that we find in a number of instances in the Bible applied to God. Meaning, Hannah was directing her heart. Prayer requires intention. directed consciousness. Moreover, her lips were moving. We read in the continuation of the verse, implying that prayer entails actual expression. Again, the act of praying is verbal. But of course, the next words, her voice was not heard. It is a speech that is not addressed to anyone other than God, and one is not to raise one's voice in prayer. And at all these levels, Chana serves as an arc template for what prayer should be. But now, one final point that we need to note, at least briefly, but I suspect we're going to have to break here and further elaborate upon this afterward, is this passage speaks of what prayer is. Is it a formal mitzvah in our tradition to pray? And this is obviously a question with respect to which one might be able to give a one-word answer, but the more rigorous response would have to be, it is a point of dissension. And while I realize that taking you all on a journey into the intricacies of rabbinical debate may be a tall order, we're going to have to consider, at least in brief, the positions that are perhaps most articulated by two of the preeminent expositors of rabbinical tradition. Rabbi Moses Maimonides lived in the most of the 12th century, and while he may be in academia better known for his philosophical contributions, in the world of Jewish scholarship he is first and foremost one of the principal codifiers of Jewish law, Jewish practice. And Rabbi Moses Nachmanides, who lived approximately 2 generations later, that is, in point of fact, Rabbi Moses Maimonides lived from 1137 or 1138, there's some disagreement about that, until 1204. Rabbi Moses Nachmanides lived from 1194 until 1270, where the former posits that there is a Torah commandment to pray, and the latter says, maybe there isn't. I realize that's a rather cryptic way upon which to conclude, but I think it's a good point at the moment to give you a break, and we'll continue with, of course, not only the practical implications, but most of all the conceptual implications in our seeking God in prayer, with that second component afterward. Any further questions? Should we ask for any questions?
Questions so far?
So, to summarize very briefly what we have seen heretofore, we discussed the various instances in which we encounter the verb palel in its reflexive form in the Bible. I keep on emphasizing that in its reflexive form is what we've discussed heretofore, because we are also going to need to consider that it isn't always in its reflexive form up ahead, a little bit later. And we considered how those instances in which the term appears, hit palel, are frequently petitionary, but not always. Frequently theurgic, not always. And inevitably trying to clarify what lehit palel does is part of the challenge. And it was in the wake of that realization, in the wake of the realization that we need to consider what prayer does, that I already warned you we're going to have to put up with some rough sailing right now in considering more rigorously what prayer is in the Jewish tradition, and to that extent what lehit palel ultimately will invoke. We already noted that in order to understand the nature of prayer in our tradition, considering lehit palel is inadequate. Le'ovdo bechol levavchem, serving him in your heart. is, if anything, in our tradition, the definitive enunciation of what prayer signifies, something that needs to be articulated, as so well exemplified by Hannah. Her lips are moving, but ultimately the fulfillment is not the lips, the fulfillment is in the heart. So, as for the rabbinical dissension, to which I already referred, Rabbi Moses Maimonides posits that there is indeed a Torah commandment to pray. That the words that we already encountered in Deuteronomy chapter 11:13 are indeed referring to this Torah commandment, and to the extent that we find various other iterations in the Torah of serving God in your heart, they are all referring essentially to this commandment to pray. From this perspective, then, one is duty-bound to say words of prayer on a daily basis, where I will also note, because I think this is also germane for our discussion, that the definition of prayer is something that comprises three component parts. Maybe we should put this down because it's important. Number one. Sorry about that. Words of praise. Addressing ourselves to God and lauding Him. Number two. I'm not doing very well here, am I? Petition. Our supplications are presented to God. And oh boy. Thanksgiving. Now, in point of fact, it is important for you to appreciate the centrality of these three components, in that in all Jewish prayer, they are present. In particular, in the archetypal expression of prayer, which is the Amidah, silent prayer that is the core of every prayer service, all three of these are manifest in the blessings that we use. In the typical daily Amidah, there are three opening blessings of praise, followed by 13 blessings of petition, followed by another 3 of thanksgiving. This again is the position that is articulated by Maimonides, where of course inevitably I do need to stress that so much more with respect to the structure of prayer is, in his view, in all views, a consequence of rabbinical legislation. The formula that we use as the core of prayer, as the core of the Amidah, while it is not only amenable to personal additions, indeed, we are enjoined to express ourselves extemporaneously in our own personal supplications, in addition to the essential basic formula. But that formula is in place for approximately 2.5 millennia. Instituted by the men of the Great Assembly. This is not a biblical construction, it is immediately post-biblical. The men of the Great Assembly in our tradition is a body initially convened by Ezra. So we're speaking about a structure that has characterized Jewish prayer for the vast majority of Jewish history. If we could be magically teleported to the period just before the men of the Great Assembly, I don't think any Jew today would recognize what was going on, or vice versa. But if we would be teleported to just 2,500 years ago after the men of the Great Assembly, oh yeah, basically the same thing. Which I must note, I feel compelled to share with you. I remember one of the first times that I was addressing a Christian group in Jerusalem. It was a group of young people, I think their denominational affiliation was overwhelmingly evangelical, which may be germane with respect to the question that I was asked. Do you Jews believe in having a personal connection with God? I mean, I must admit that I was new in those days, and I think I did a good job of concealing my shock and going on to explain that we are enjoined to at least 100 times every day utter blessings of the form, you, God, our Lord, Master of the universe, are blessed. Everyone in direct second person confrontation to God. But be that as it may, I gathered subsequently that it may have been more of an expression of these young people with respect to the Orthodox churches, the whole idea of there existing a set liturgy rather than anything that was particularly directed against me as a Jew. I'm prepared to accept that, but if anything, from our perspective, the liturgy is something that is of prodigious power precisely because of the extent to which it links us to our forefathers. It links us to a tradition that is, again, 2.5 millennia strong and going strong to this day. But that's, again, the core of prayer from the perspective of Rabbi Moses Maimonides. Rabbi Moses Nachmanides, in particular in his critique of Maimonides' compendium of the commandments of the Torah, proposes a different perspective. The nuances of the basis of the alternative view, I think, will take us too far afield for the parameters of the present discussion, but the conclusion is certainly germane, except he presents two conclusions, not one. Conclusion number one is that there is no Torah commandment to pray, rather that prayer, rather than being a commandment, is in fact a gift. And that gift is perhaps best articulated when we consider the words of Deuteronomy, chapter 4, verse 7. What great nation is there to whom God is close as God our Lord whenever we call upon him? So it's a gift, promise. God is close whenever we call upon him. The opportunity to pray, then, whenever we are beset by travails that engender prayer. Rabbi Moses Nachmanides then presents a second conclusion, if you will, an alternative conclusion, which is that there is a commandment to pray in time of travail. Now, you might initially think, wait, the second conclusion is agreeing with Maimonides. The second conclusion is saying that there is a commandment to pray. Right? Not exactly. There is, according to the second alternative, a commandment to pray. But it is essentially a different commandment. Because I remind you again that from the perspective of Rabbi Moses Maimonides, prayer is something that you do on a daily basis. You do it on a daily basis at the risk of sounding excessively blunt here, because it is part of your daily regimen. We're going to need to consider why that should be. For Rabbi Moses Nachmanides, prayer, even if it is a commandment, is still reflective of the dialogue with God in time of travail. And that aspect of the travail providing the impetus that engenders prayer is evidently definitional and critical in his portrayal of what prayer signifies, whether or not it's a commandment. We would do well to consider why that might be so. Because I think ultimately, in my attempting to fulfill the charge that I was given for these meetings, I need to present a coherent view of prayer that addresses both of these alternatives, since these two remain of archetypal significance in the world of prayer from the perspective of the Jewish tradition. To begin with Rabbi Moses Nachmanides, which I realize is an inversion of their chronological order, but I think conceptually will make things a bit easier. Apropos of what we saw at the outset, prayer, first and foremost, is petitionary. Prayer, then, in as much as it springs from averting a decree, is the way we react to the travails that beset us in our turning to God. Now, this is something that on manifold planes is indeed of extraordinary power in considering the nature of our relationship with God. And in this context, I feel compelled to review briefly something that, if my memory serves me correctly, I said 2 years ago here as well. And that is to consider what takes place in Genesis chapter 3. In the wake of the sin that takes place in the Garden of Eden. How many culprits are there in the crime? Reading straight out of the Bible. Genesis chapter 3. How many culprits? Number 1? No? Snake. Number 2? Eve. Number 3? Adam. Okay, there. We have 3. In the biblical narrative, we read of these 3 culprits. How many of them are punished? Well, obviously, all 3. How many are cursed? Just the snake. You remember? Only the snake is cursed. But what exactly is the curse of the snake? The curse of the snake is you will go on your belly and eat dust all the days of your life. If I may share with you, as I did at the time, the comment of the great Hasidic master, the 19th century Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotsk. What's the curse? If the snake would have had kilometer-high legs and be condemned to eat dust, that's a curse. If your head is in the clouds, how are you going to get to the dust? Well, I don't know what your house looks like, but in my house, if you're going to go on your belly, you'll find your dust without any difficulty, without any deficiency, without any inadequacy. You'll have dust galore. So what's the curse? Inevitably, to answer that question, we need to ask ourselves, well, what's the opposite of the curse? What is the utmost good? And to that question, we read the answer of Asaph in Psalm 73, verse 28, the last verse. In the Hebrew, V'ani kirvat Elokim litov. As for me, closeness to God is the good. No.
Which psalm was it?
Psalm 73, verse 28. Now, in order to consider the implications of this verse in context here, we need to consider an additional verse that I concede at the outset I cannot truly understand. I don't think any of us really can. But nonetheless, we read in Psalm 104, in verse 21, the young lions roar for prey and ask of God their food. I don't really understand that because I'm not a lion, but on some plane, implicit in the verse is that by the lion roaring for prey, the lion has a connection with God. Every living thing is endowed with needs. The giver, the ultimate giver of all of our needs is God. Every living thing, not even just human beings, through those needs has a bond to God. Every living thing, except one, the snake in the Garden of Eden. Says God, I decreed upon you existence. You will have everything you need to keep on existing. Everything except the one thing that matters, a connection with me. Take your dust and get out of here. That's the curse. Adam and Eve are cursed. The connection with God is never sundered. With the snake it is a curse because that connection is sundered. The converse, inevitably, is that by our having needs, by our experiencing travail, God is giving us a prodigious gift. The gift of appreciating that we need to come to Him. So for Rabbi Moses Nachmanides, again I'm going to reiterate, while, as we will yet see, prayer is not only petitionary, nonetheless, the petitionary aspect is definitional, and it is indeed right up there when prayer is first introduced in the Bible, because that aspect of petitioning God, because I am experiencing travail, because I need that connection with God, is an essential component of there being any meaning of which to speak in my life. That meaning is an appeal to God, to the connection with God that derives from my needs. So again, in the position of Rabbi Moses Nachmanides, prayer may be a commandment, or it may not. But either way, what defines prayer is that hour of travail that serves as the impetus for me to appreciate that I have needs, and there's only one source for answering those needs, and that is God. Again, that's the position of Rabbi Moses Nachmanides, but our presentation is not going to be complete unless we consider the other alternative. What is Rabbi Moses Maimonides telling us about prayer? And of course, again, we reiterate the inescapable verity that prayer, from his perspective, is not something that is specifically occasioned by need, but rather part of the daily regimen. Now, there is one critically important point that I must clarify right now, and that is, if you're wondering, from the perspective of Rabbi Moses Maimonides, is there any aspect of turning to God in time of travail? There is an unequivocal answer to this question. The answer is yes. I know that, first of all, because he says so. He discusses it in 3 of his principal works in his voluminous literary legacy at length. He discusses it in his compendium on the commandments, in his code of Jewish practice, and in Guide of the Perplexed. But what is critical to consider here is, while this is definitely an intrinsic precept in Jewish practice, it is not prayer. It's a different precept. It is specifically what is derived from Numbers chapter 10, verse 9. The passage pertains to the horns, the trumpets, that God enjoins Moses to make. And while they have the role that they do in the immediate local context of the journeying in the wilderness, we read further, again in chapter 10, verse 9, when you come to war in your land upon the adversary who is attacking you, you shall blow the trumpets. Blast the trumpets. And be remembered before God your Lord, and be saved from your enemies. There is a nuance that is tantalizing in the portrayal of this commandment by Maimonides, in that one can trace a chronology of his principal compositions as I already listed them. First, the volume listing the 613 mitzvot, the 613 precepts of the Torah, in which the emphasis in this commandment is on the blasting of the trumpets. Second, in his Code of Jewish Practice, which was composed subsequently, in which he doesn't focus upon the blasting of the trumpets, he focuses upon screaming out to God and blasting the trumpets. Third, in Guide of the Perplexed, in the final section of Maimonides' philosophical magnum opus, second part of the third unit of the guide, he speaks of the reasons for the commandments, and he focuses upon this one without even mentioning the trumpets, just screaming out to God. I must note that although I don't know if there's any way of verifying this one way or the other, the very language that Rabbi Moses Nachmanides uses in describing the imperative to call out to God in times of travail seems to me to have been markedly influenced by the words of Rabbi Moses Maimonides in Guide of the Perplexed in Unit 3, Chapter 36, in describing this commandment, which again I'm going to reiterate, is not the commandment to pray. The commandment to call out to God in time of travail. But now, this also impels me to share with you another critically important observation with respect to Maimonides' presentation of the commandments in the Guide of the Perplexed. That is, to give you a very brief overview of the architecture of this section of the guide, following some 10 introductory chapters on the subject of the reasons for the commandments. In Unit 3, Chapter 35, Maimonides divides up all of the 613 commandments of the Torah into 14 categories. 14 categories for the purposes of conceptual analysis. And then in the following 14 chapters, chapter 36 through chapter 49, he elaborates one chapter per category upon each of the mitzvot, each of the precepts of the Torah in that category. Okay, the first category in this progression, the first of the 14 categories, the subject of chapter 36, one might argue characteristically for Maimonides, is intellectual doctrines that one must affirm. It is significant to note that this calling out to God in times of travail, Maimonides characterizes as an intellectual doctrine. What intellectual doctrine? Believing in divine providence. The essential belief that God is in control and that when I experience travail, I need to turn to Him. That's an intellectual doctrine right up there in the first of these categories. In chapter 44 in this progression, way down the list, Maimonides addresses the precepts about which he elaborates in his Code of Jewish Practice in its second volume. And this is also a point that I feel compelled to share with you with respect to his Weltanschauung. The first volume is Sefer Mada, the volume of knowledge. The second volume is Sefer Ahava, the book of love. Prayer is in the book of love, not in the book of knowledge. It's not the only one. All of the blessings are in the book of love. The recitation of the Shema is in the book of love. In chapter 44 of the third unit, Maimonides explains what these commandments are intended to engender. And if I can summarize briefly, you're of course welcome to see the formulation in his own words. But in short, these precepts are intended to engender, to cultivate a religious personality. Cultivating a religious personality is not a matter of merely intellectual doctrines. It is an attitude. It's an orientation. Prayer, in Maimonides' formulation, falls into that category. Why indeed does he not regard it as in the former category? Well, perhaps because when we consider just what we read with respect to prayer generally, consider, if you will, with respect to words of praise, the words of Psalm 106, verse 2. Who can recount the might of God and make known all of his praise? A rhetorical question. Obviously, the answer is no one. And that answer is perhaps more explicitly given in Psalm 65, verse 2. To you, the greatest praise is silence. On the level of intellectual doctrine, how can we possibly think that we have anything that we could possibly enunciate, possibly articulate with respect to God? So utterly transcendent beyond our capacity to even minimally grasp him. So prayer is not part of the intellectual doctrines. So why do we have it? Cultivate the religious personality. If we were to take the implicit instruction that emerges from Psalm 106 verse 2 and from Psalm 65 verse 2 at face value, the first immediate corollary would be, we wouldn't have the Psalms. That is, if you can't say anything, then how can you say anything at all? How can you have the Psalms in the first place? But if we wouldn't have them, we wouldn't have the basis for indeed groping upward, striving to come closer to God. The striving to have a relationship, ultimately, perhaps most critically, is the striving to become godly, to raise ourselves to a level that can, at the very least, metaphorically, allegorically be described as connected with God. Not literally, granted. But then we will fall into the trap of intellectual doctrines at the exclusion of all else. Intellectual doctrines, I reiterate, is Maimonides' first category, but by no means the only one, because manifestly, not all of the Torah is affirming intellectual doctrines. Indeed, the vast majority is what you do to do that which is right. Now, mind you, that doesn't imply that all of the Torah is merely about cultivating a religious personality. There's much that pertains to social justice, there's much that pertains to invoking other principles and other ideas, granted. But engendering, cultivating a religious personality is still critically part of the agenda if we are to become godly. And we must. And so, to that extent, from Maimonides' perspective, the essential role of prayer is not petitionary, it is part of a daily regimen. It is something you do. Now, if you ask, can it have theurgic consequences, according to Maimonides? I'll respond on two planes. Number one, remember, we still have that commandment of screaming out to God at times of travail. Can it elicit a literal answer? Of course it can. Perhaps most critically we should stress, and this is the second component of the answer, to whatever extent, through that cultivation of religious personality, I am transformed. I make myself into a more godly human being. Even if we grant that a decree has already been decreed. The decree was decreed upon whom I was prior to having prayed. By consequence of the prayer, I may have made myself into a different person who will no longer be the just recipient of the harsh decree that had been decreed previously. That's not exactly theurgic. That's not a matter of some, if you'll excuse the expression, quasi-magical consequence of prayer. That's rather the arduous task of transforming oneself. Now, if you ask me, is that the only thing that prayer can do? I suspect that according to Rabbi Moses Nachmanides, the answer would emphatically be no. I'm not quite sure that Rabbi Moses Maimonides would agree. But let's consider in this regard what is perhaps the most critical question that needs to be asked regarding prayer that I feel, maybe you do as well, has been lurking in the wings for the last hour and a half, and most critically must be addressed if we are to achieve even a modicum of understanding of what prayer signifies. And that is, it's all well and good to speak of prayer eliciting an answer. At its best, theurgic prayer. Is that the way life really proceeds? Is there anyone who can testify, whenever I pray, I am answered? Would we even want to live in such a world? If God's determination is a reflection of absolute truth, absolute justice, absolute righteousness, absolute goodness, what exactly are we trying to change? And inevitably, in our considering how prayer operates, this becomes a critically important question. And it is inevitably, too, one that is on manifold planes discussed in our tradition, in the Jewish tradition. I'll note first, as a case in point, that there are indeed many passages that enunciate in our tradition in particular, in the Talmud and Midrash, in the wake of the passage that we already discussed with respect to petitionary theurgic prayer, the greatness of prayer. As a case in point, the Talmudic statement that prayer is even greater than good deeds by themselves, because there is no one who exemplified good deeds better than Moses. And nevertheless, he was answered based upon his prayer. When God says to him, ascend to the summit of the mountain of Mount Nebo and gaze upon the land and see it with your eyes. That's a consequence of his having prayed. This is in Deuteronomy chapter 3, the immediate aftermath of God saying to him, enough, pray no more about this subject. Now ascend the mountaintop. You may have some justified questions with respect to this exposition. I'll be returning to it very shortly. But the Talmud presents it as exemplifying prayer being answered. We'll note further a principle that is one of the essential themes in the liturgy of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippurim, the New Year and Day of Atonement, the days of awe, that there are three things that can avert the evil decree. Among them, prayer. The others are tzedakah, helping the needy, and repentance. And these are all associated with one verse in Chronicles 2, chapter 7, verse 14. The summons of the people is v'yitpalalu, that they pray, obviously referring to prayer. V'yivkshu fanai, they seek my countenance, for reasons that aren't germane for our discussion at present. That's understood as pertaining to tzedakah, helping the needy. V'yashuvu midarchehem haraim, and that they return from their evil ways. Of course, referring to repentance. And again, the premise that through doing so, the evil decree may indeed be averted. And yet, again I reiterate, we know very well, we don't live in a world in which there is any facile guarantee that such will be the case. Why not? On the one hand, how typical for Jews to say, on the one hand, then we'll get to the other hand, but you're used to that. On the one hand, of course we realize that the fact that one has gone through the motions of prayer is by no means, in and of itself, an adequate guarantee of having truly prayed. And I cite in this regard a principle that is affirmed in the Talmud based upon the words of rebuke of God to the prophet Samuel when, upon seeing Eliav, David's older brother, he thinks he has encountered God's anointed. And in the words of rebuke in first book of Samuel, in chapter 16, in verse 7, it is not as man sees, because man sees the eyes, God sees the heart. God sees the heart. In our tradition, the attendant expression, the Holy One, blessed be He, demands the heart. Now mind you, God demands the heart does not mean one can commit every travesty and every crime in the world as long as one has a good heart. On the contrary, it means just the opposite. Even if one is utterly a saint, but without the appropriate motivation, that's still not adequate. Even if you do everything that's right, you still need to have the heart. And again, of course, I remind you of the essential principle that pertains to prayer, that while the action is verbal, the fulfillment is in the heart. So of course, if someone has gone through the motions but has not actually prayed, one could scarcely expect any consequence of having done anything. And perhaps the most vivid and admittedly terrifying passage in the Bible that pertains precisely to that is the words of God through Isaiah in chapter 29, in verses 13 and 14. God said, because this people has drawn near. So far it sounds good. They've drawn near, right? Yeah. With their mouth and their lips, they honor me. Even better, they're honoring God, right? But their heart is far from me. And the reverence of me is like the actions, the mitzvah, the precept of people who learn from rote. Therefore, I will smite this people wondrously, and the wisdom of their wise will be lost, and the understanding of their sagacious will be concealed. And the gravity of the punishment is precisely because they drew near. But it was all superficial. It was all a facade. It was all a veneer, and it wasn't internal. So obviously, under such circumstances, we can scarcely expect that prayer is going to be efficacious. And in much this vein, apropos of the words of Isaiah that we cited at the very beginning in this exercise, from Isaiah chapter 57, verse 19, that God is described as the one who creates expression of the lips. If a person, through expression of his lips, produces, as in the Hebrew, imasu siftotav tnuva, if he has indeed produced through expression of his lips, then he can consider himself heralded that his prayer is heard. Then, and of course, only then. So that is, I admit, on the one hand, that we shouldn't imagine to ourselves that anything that looks like prayer and sounds like prayer is in fact prayer. And yet at the same time, we have manifold statements, and these too are anchored in the words of the Bible that imply otherwise. After all, in Isaiah chapter 55, verse 6, we read, "Seek God when He can be found," inevitably implying that He can't always. And in our tradition, that is taken to mean that the gates of prayer sometimes are open and sometimes are sealed shut. And perhaps more explicitly, more terrifyingly, the words of, in our tradition, the author of Lamentations is Jeremiah. The words of Jeremiah in Lamentations chapter 3. In verse 8, Even though I scream and call out, he has shut out my prayer. Verse 44, you have shrouded yourself as if in a cloud to prevent prayer from penetrating. So that even when the prayer may be worthy, it may get nowhere. And in much this vein, likewise, the implicit consequence of the words of David in Psalm 69, verse 14, my prayer is to you, God, at a time of favor, implying there are times of favor and there are times that are not. And finally, since I employed in the Talmudic passage that I cited a few moments ago, the illustration of Moses as exemplifying prayer being answered, and I cautioned you to hold off a little bit because I'm sure what we were all wondering is, wait a second, prayer answered? What was his prayer? His prayer was to enter the promised land on the west side of the Jordan. But it wasn't answered. He didn't get in. And indeed, the Midrash enunciates this very point, commenting on the words of Ecclesiastes chapter 9, verse 11. I returned and saw beneath the sun that the race is not for the swift, nor is the battle for the mighty, nor is bread for the wise, nor is wealth for the sagacious, nor is grace for those who know, because time and circumstance befall everyone. Comments the Midrash. There are times when a person strikes with prayer and is answered, and there are times when a person strikes and is not answered. Because there is no one who prayed more assiduously, with more supplications than Moses. And in the end, God says to him, the days of your death have drawn near, and you're not going in. So, what do we do about all this? First thing we do is we go back to Palel. We go back to Palel because I left a critically important matter dangling when we considered this verb first time around. And that is, I kept on accentuating that we were talking about the reflexive form, hit Palel, which indeed, in nearly all, if not all of its appearances, can best be translated as praying. It might seem odd that we translate a verb that in its literal declination means doing whatever is to oneself as praying, which is not reflexive. But that makes it all the more instructive for us to consider how this verb is used, rarely, but it is, in a non-reflexive form. For the Hebrew experts, in the PL declination. And I'd like to share with you briefly, I realize our time is running out, but briefly to consider at least some of the instances in which Palel appears in the PL form. And consider what, if anything, it tells us with respect to this enterprise that we are rendering as prayer, but evidently we need to render a little bit differently. Where is the first instance in which Palel appears in the Bible not in its reflexive form? First instance is in Genesis chapter 48. Now, admittedly, the problem here, we're referring to verse 11, is it's not entirely clear what the verb means here, which is why one example will not suffice. But when Jacob meets Joseph, he says to him, seeing your face, lo filalti. I don't know what it means, but it certainly doesn't mean I didn't pray. Philel. Does it mean I didn't think to see you? It could well. That is indeed a cogent proposal for what Palel means most essentially. perhaps I didn't judge that I would ever see you? Well, admittedly, that second proposal is a little bit tendentious, but it's a reflection of the other instances in which we find this root not in a reflexive form in the 5 books of Moses. The only other 2 instances in which we encounter it, again, not in its reflexive form, it isn't a verb altogether, it is a noun. They are in Exodus chapter 21, verse 22. The context being when 2 people are fighting with one another and there is an innocent bystander who ends up being injured. The specifics, if they strike a pregnant woman and she miscarries as a result. And the end of the verse tells us that the assailant will be punished as the husband of the wife levies it upon him and will give, the Hebrew states, v'natan biflilim, in the original Aramaic translation of the Torah, which serves as arguably the oldest written commentary. V'natan biflilim, he shall pay according to the judges. In other words, biflilim, according to judges, plili, plilim, referring to matters of judgment. In much the same vein, and almost exactly the same word, spelled slightly differently, in Moses' song, in Deuteronomy chapter 32, in verse 31, sorry? Chapter 32, verse 31. Deuteronomy. Sorry, I'm sorry about that.
33?
Deuteronomy chapter 32, verse 31. Our rock, that is our God, is not as theirs, referring to the heathen enemy. Ve'oyevenu pelilim, which again, rendered in the Aramaic translation, means our enemies are judging us. So the root seems to pertain to matters of judgment. Again, we can cite a number of additional instances, but given that our time is limited, we'll let these suffice. But certainly emerges from these various instances of palel, not in its reflexive form, but rather in its PL form, is that if palel essentially refers to judgment, then when you engage in the act of lehit palel reflexively, perhaps what it means is you are enjoined to judge yourself. And indeed, this is an idea that we certainly find enunciated in later sources. I'll note, at least briefly, that perhaps one of the first authors to explicitly make reference to the PL form as casting light on what the enterprise of Lehit Palel means is the great 16th century scholar, Rabbi Judah Lowy of Prague, often known by the acronym the Maharal of Prague, who proposes that perhaps the particular nuance of Palel pertains more generically to thought. But a couple of centuries later, the great 19th century scholar, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, in his commentaries on both the Torah and on the Psalms, specifically develops this theme of judgment. And I'd like to share with you, at least briefly, from his commentary on that first instance, remember, in Genesis chapter 20, verse 7, where we encounter Hit Palel. As a general rule, in his commentary, he delves into the etymology of critically important words upon their first appearance. And so he writes, with respect to the Yitpalel Be'adcha, that Abraham will pray on your behalf. I'm reading from the English translation. You may be better able to read the original than I, because the commentary was originally written in German. I have at home English and Hebrew translations of it. Unfortunately, I can't read the original. But the Yitpalel Ba'adcha, comments Rabbi Hirsch, from Palel, to judge. The judge brings justice and right, the divine truths of matters, into the matter, makes it go into and penetrate all phases of the dispute, and, by true justice, brings about a harmonious unity into that which without it was clamoring dissension. Doing this to oneself is called hitpalel. Hitpalel means to take the elements of God's truth, make it penetrate all phases and conditions of our being and our life, and thereby gain for ourselves the harmonious, even tenor of our whole existence in God. Jewish tefillah is accordingly the most complete contrast to what is generally called prayer. It is not an outflowing from within, an expression of that with which the heart is already filled. For that, we have other expressions. Techina, siach, referring to supplication and verbal expression. Rather, it is a renewed intake and penetration of truth which comes from outside. Meaning, of course, on the most basic plane, judging oneself, that very process of inner growth and development to which we referred earlier as perhaps the basis of prayer being answered because I changed myself into someone else, undoubtedly is part of that process of internal judgment. But there's the additional dimension. When one considers the activity of the judge, what does the judge do? The litigants are coming before the judge at one another's throats, clamoring dissension. The judge, through the divine truths that override this dispute, imposes order and structure, and of course brings them into harmony with one another, as until now they could not do on their own. And so too with respect to ourselves. Within our souls we feel that strife, that inner discontent, that dissension, that cries out for God's truths to impose order and structure and show us the way. And it's not then something that comes as an overflowing from within, it is something that we impose upon ourselves from without. Consider again the nuance of the biblical expression with respect to what Chana is doing, that is so highlighted in the words of the Talmud and the Midrash. The Chana medaberet al liba. Chana was speaking upon her heart. I'm on top, my heart is below me, and I am imposing upon my heart what it needs to hear. And continues Rabbi Hirsch, if our prayers were not tefillah, if our praying were not hitpalel, working on our inner self to bring it on the heights of recognition of the truth and to resolutions for serving God, there would be no sense in having fixed times and prescribed forms for them. For this assumes that periodically, at fixed times, the masses of a community are always filled with one and the same state of feelings, one and the same trend of thoughts. After all, we also place a premium on praying together. Everyone is going to feel this in advance, ready to pour out our hearts to God. Such prayers would rather be superfluous. Feelings and thoughts which are already lively within us have no need first to be expressed, and least of all in set phrases placed in our hands. When the heart is full, it can always find its own way to express itself, or it can be so full that words, mere words, mean nothing, and inarticulate silence is the only expression of such depths of feeling. Hence, our prescribed prayers are not facts, truths, which they assume we are already fully conscious of, but are such that they wish to awaken, reanimate, and keep ever afresh in us. One can truly say that the less we feel inclined to prayers, the greater is the necessity for saying them, the greater the importance, the greater the effect on us of the work which we have to accomplish on ourselves by tefillah, by prayer. The lack of the inclination for it is itself the clearest sign of the clouding over and darkening of that spirit and that recognition of the great truth which tefillah, prayer, does not assume us to have, but which it rather is to create, animate, and set right in us. Now, inevitably, of course, when we consider the implications, where this leads us in what prayer means as part of the daily regimen, the implications are fairly straightforward, and I feel compelled on this plane to share with you an analogy that is first articulated by the great medieval scholar, Rabbi Judah Halevi, and in the interest of full disclosure, I must admit that he is personally my foremost mentor. I realize it's a somewhat pretentious statement to make, to refer to someone who lived almost 900 years ago, but I feel I was most molded by his thought. And in considering in his philosophical magnum opus, the Kuzari, the manner in which the pious man prays, he draws an analogy to meals. Why is it that after you have eaten once, you still need to eat again? Well, you say, of course, that's a stupid question. You become depleted afterward, and eventually you're hungry. Well, says Rabbi Judah Halevi, the same thing is true with prayer. You pray in order to rejuvenate, recharge your spiritual batteries. Then what do? Then you go out into the world. Because after all, the whole charge of God is to follow Him, follow in His footsteps in fixing up the world. But when you go out to fix up the world, inevitably you become depleted, spiritually depleted. Just as eventually you will be physically depleted and in need of another meal, you will become spiritually depleted and in need of another prayer. So 3 meals a day is optional, but 3 prayers a day is mandatory. As we see in Daniel, he prays 3 times a day. Because when I am sallying forth into the world in the morning, wait, stop, where do we think I'm going? I pray to impose upon my life that divine order and structure, so that when I run out into the world, I know I'm doing it as following God's mission as He has given it to me. At the end of the day, before retiring, where did I actually go today? What did I do? That reflection, judge myself. Who am I now as opposed to who I was at the beginning of the day? And also in the middle of the day, stop. Where are you between the first point and the closing point? Where are you in that continuum? Where are you going? Are you judging where you are? Are you imposing God's truths upon your life? That, most essentially, is the identity of prayer. And if I may, by way of conclusion then, simply consider one of the most enigmatic passages of Hitpalel that we noted at the outset, and with this we'll conclude. Remember Jonah chapter 2? Remember that glaringly absent, get me out of here? So what's the purpose of chapter 2? Well, of course, inevitably, if we are to understand why chapter 2 is there in the first place, we need to remember chapter 1. How did Jonah get into this bind altogether? Because, as you undoubtedly recall, we read in chapter 1, verse 3, that Jonah arose to flee to Tarsus. In the Hebrew, it's mi lifnei Hashem. No, that does not translate to flee from God. That might be me'et Hashem. And indeed, in the Midrash, the fact that the formulation is mi lifnei Hashem is accentuated. Someone who has risen to the height of prophecy could not possibly be such a blithering idiot as to think that it's possible to run away from God. He was fleeing from the status of Lifnei Hashem, standing before God. Where do you stand before God? In God's land. That's the land of prophecy. Jonah doesn't want to be a prophet. So he figures the best solution is, let me get out of this land and then I won't have to be a prophet. And of course, while God could break his own rules and give him prophecy outside of the land, God has an infinitely better solution. I will bring you back to the land, in the belly of a fish, and you will prophesy again in the land. But before that can happen, inasmuch as what took place in chapter 1, verse 3, was essentially after God had called up Jonah, Jonah had slammed the telephone and hung up on God. First thing he needs to do, pick up the phone again. Chapter 2 is picking up the phone and dialing God. He doesn't need to say, indeed, it would be pathetically superfluous to say, get me out of here. That's not the issue. That's not the problem. And therefore, it's not the solution. The problem was hanging up on God. The problem was trying to flee from being in God's presence, from heeding the mission that God had given him. The solution is, I read you loud and clear. I'm picking up the phone. I'm coming back. In a nutshell, what prayer is all about. Picking up the phone and dialing God. Thank you.